Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm sorry for all the mix-up, but I hope that this recorded class works for you. And we're going to carry on our discussion today about plants, my favorite topic in actual fact, one of my favorite topics. Here's where we ended off last time. We are discussing the land plants. We're not going to, unfortunately, enter into any discussion about the algae, which is unfortunate because they're so interesting. But we're talking now about the land plants. And land plants, we recognize living land plants are divided into different groups. First of all, the most primitive of all the living land plant groups are the Bryophytes. And they are reflective of probably somewhat similar to the early land plants that emerged, most probably about 500 million years ago or so. And they are characterized by the fact that they are, in general, limited in size because they are non-vascular. And you'll understand that a bit better in a while when we talk about plant vasculature. But these are non-vascular plants. Then the other major group that are so dominant in modern times are divided into two groups. These are the vascular plants, but they are divided into the seedless vascular plants, which are all of those things, the ferns and their allies. Once upon a time, ferns and their allies were the dominant vegetative form and formed huge forests. They were limited to marshland, bordering water, that kind of thing. They are seedless vascular plants, and they have a rather more primitive reproductive cycle, which is somewhat similar to that of the Bryophytes. The other group of vascular plants are the seed plants, which evolved much later. The first group to evolve were the Gymnosperms, those things like conifers, the pine trees, etc., etc. And then, of course, the land plants, which are now the dominant form worldwide over the whole planet, and those are the flowering plants, which really came to prominence only about 65 million years ago, around about there. Okay, so that's going to be the topic of our discussion, and today we'll try and get as far as we can, probably ending up our discussion around the ferns. Okay, so that division of the land plants into those which have vascular tissue and those which do not have vascular tissue is tremendously important in terms of the way that the plants function, but also in terms of how the plants were structured. Now, this group, the Bryophytes, a very poorly understood group, but they clearly have no true vessels inside the plant body, which will conduct water. That means that water and nutrients have to diffuse into the plant and have to diffuse through the plant rather inefficiently, which limits the plant's size and everything. But the other thing about it is that the non-vascular plants the vascular plants rather can use their vasculature as a structural element. And it is the vasculature that allows plants to resist the force of gravity and to actually grow upright. And the Bryophytes, which lack a vasculature, are therefore limited in size because they simply can't get big. They fall over. And that's not very advantageous. Okay, so we're going to spend some time as well talking about the seedless vascular plants. There's two groups, one that you will definitely have heard of, the other you may not have heard of. The first group of the seedless vascular plants are the Lycophytes. And the Lycophytes are a group that's still widespread, but now reduced in size. At one time, they were dominant and very large forms in the forests which bordered the marshlands, rivers, etc. And the Lycophytes are one group who contributed in a major way to the formation of coal beds. So we spend a little time. This is what most of the modern Lycophytes look like, there and there. They occur quite commonly, but they're rather small. The pterophytes are the ferns and their allies, and ferns vary a lot in size, but they can actually get really large. You will have heard of giant ferns, which are almost tree-like, maybe 10, 15 feet high or so. So there immediately we realize that the plants are structured, their vasculature, for one thing, but also the structuring of the trunk allows them to become large. If you're a large plant, what do? You rise above the other plants so that you get the optimal amount of light. You shade out your competitors underneath, and you get the optimal amount of light. Becoming large as a plant is very, very advantageous. In addition, if you're up high and you're spreading spores and things, your spores spread very widely, which is another evolutionary advantage. Okay, so those groups are seedless. And now we need to think about what we mean by a seed. Well, a seed, by definition, is an embryo plant, together usually, not always, but usually together with nutrients, and it's surrounded by a protective coat. So the embryo and the protective coat is absolutely required for it to be a seed, and most seeds also contain a nutrient source for the embryo. The seed plants very clearly form a clade. They share a common ancestor, no matter the fact that they are very diverse. And we recognize these two groups, the gymnosperms. Gymnosperm actually means naked seed. And you'll see the reason we say it's a naked seed in a while. The angiosperms are the flowering plants, and they have a very, very distinctive reproductive cycle. They are very different in their reproductive cycle. We can see how it has been derived from earlier ancestors, but it is a very advanced form of reproduction. Both the gymnosperms and the angiosperms produce seeds. Here are gymnosperm seeds from a pine tree. And if you know what pine nuts are, they're very hard outer coating and then a delicious inner nut that is largely composed of the embryo with some nutrient tissue. And these, of course, are all seeds, probably familiar to you: beans, sunflower, etc., etc. These are seeds from flowering plants. Not a lot of difference, in fact, in the structure of the seed between the two, but very big questions in evolutionary terms about how that seed arose, because we don't see very many intermediate forms of plants between seedless plants and the seeded plants. There's one group, though, that we will talk about that may have been, in which the ancestor of the seed plants may have lain. Okay, so let's talk about the bryophytes first of all, the mosses and other non-vascular plants. They have one characteristic which sets them apart. They have number, but there's one to remember really significantly. And that is that in the bryophytes, the gametophyte stage of the alternating life cycle, the gametophyte stage is the dominant phase. And the sporophyte is less, I wouldn't say it's less important, but it's a shorter lived and less apparent part of the plant, and it is usually parasitic on the gametophyte. And the gametophyte usually outlives the sporophyte. There are three groups in the bryophytes. these non-vascular plants. They are the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. The mosses, of course, would be apparent to you. And although we unfortunately don't have a lab to do so, you can find abundant mosses at the moment. They're all over the place after the winter, and as the weather warms, they are all out, and many of them have both life cycles present, the gametophyte and the sporophyte, for you to find if you go and look for them. So this is a structure of a typical moss. And this part here, this is the gametophyte. And the first thing you notice is this is the strongly photosynthetic. This has a stem with flat leaves, all bright green, photosynthetic. And this, compared to the sporophyte, the gametophyte is relatively long-lived. Very often, the gametophytes can actually, it depends on the species, but very often the gametophytes can live for years, and they are often resistant to desiccation. So they will spring up in summer, in the spring rather, after the winter rains, and they're hydrated, and then it warms up. And then as summer comes, they will dry up, only to be revived again once they get wet again. So some of them actually are very long-lived, and they can form, the gametophytes can reproduce asexually. That's how mosses spread out and form mats. And so they can form lots and lots and lots of sporophytes. So the sporophytes are typically, they're only there for a part of the time. Here, sorry, I need to go back. That's the gametophyte there. And here is the sporophyte there. It has a stalk called the seta. And at the end, this club-shaped thing here, that is the sporangium. And that is where meiosis is taking place to produce haploid spores. And those haploid spores are then going to be liberated and form new gametophytes. Okay, so let me just show you one other thing. That is here at the bottom. They do have an anchoring system. These are not true roots. A true root is something that absorbs water nutrient and then distributes it through a vasculature to the rest of the plant. That does not happen here. Instead, this is really just an anchoring system. It may absorb some water, but the water it absorbs is just kept locally. And water actually has to diffuse through the plant when under rainfall and things like that, along with nutrients. So this is a big limitation for the size of this little plant. So remember that the life cycle is an alternation of generations. This is a typical life cycle, but it is not definitive. That's, I would say, put it that way. I'll point out where it's not definitive anymore. But this is a very common kind of moss life cycle. And here is the plant we saw before, gametophyte. And here is the sporophyte, parasitic on the gametophyte. And if we look at the mouth of the gametophyte there, you can see here, this is what it's like. It actually has hairs which open when they are wet, so that when it rains and it's suitable for the spores to germinate, the sporangium opens to release the spores. It closes up when it's dry. Now here's where this is not definitive life cycle. In this one shown here, there are two kinds of spore. There are male spores and there are female spores. The forming male gametophytes and female gametophytes. In some mosses, they actually, the plant, both male and female, are together in the plant. It's just a minor point. You can just remember this one. So these are haploid, the spores are haploid, and the gametophyte is haploid. So the gametophyte produces gametes, but it does so by mitosis. It doesn't have to undergo meiosis because it's already haploid. So they undergo meiosis. Remember, the sperm are produced in an antheridium, that's the male organ for production of gametes. The females produce eggs in an archegonium, and the females hold on to that egg. The sperm, of course, is released into the environment. The egg is held. That is why this is an embryophyte. It is holding onto the egg. Here it is here. This is the archegonium here with a neck. And this is another limitation for these more primitive plants, is that the gametophyte has to be flooded in order for fertilization to take place, because the sperm have to swim to the archegonium. The archegonium, I've told you before, it actually emits chemicals which attract the sperm towards it. After fertilization, the sporophyte germinates inside the gametophyte. Here's the embryo here. Here's a young sporophyte here, and it remains parasitic on that gametophyte. Grows, undergoes meiosis inside the sporangium to form spores again. Typical alternation of generations. And keep it in mind, because this kind of life cycle is preserved throughout the land plants. It becomes highly, highly modified later on in the gymnosperms and the flowering plants. But the roots of the life cycles of all of the land plants lie here in this kind of alternation of generations. Okay, so just show you a couple. This is a liverwort, also easily found, not depending on where you are, very, very common in forests on rotting logs and things like that. And this is the female gametophyte here. Now, these liverworts can also reproduce asexually. You see here, they can produce little cells that can be liberated to form new gametophytes asexually as well. So they spread very, very widely. This is, you may not ever have seen. You certainly can find them if you look carefully. This is a hornwort, closely related to the liverworts and the bryophytes, apparently, although we don't understand the exact relationship between them, but a very similar kind of life cycle. Here's gametophyte on the bottom here, and these here are the sporophytes. They don't have a club like a moss. The whole thing produces spores. That's Anthoceros, if you like to remember names. But here's the very typical moss. This is Polytrichum, and this is one that you'll find everywhere. Go for a walk in Prospect Park or wherever, or the Botanic Gardens, and you'll almost certainly be able to find moss in Polytrichum or something very similar. Again, dominant plant is the gametophyte, and here are the sporophytes here, parasitic on the gametophyte. Okay, so those were very limited in size. The ferns and their allies were the first plants that were able to, land plants that were able to grow very large. And they arose about 400 million years ago, and they diversified, especially during the Devonian and the Carboniferous period. In fact, the Carboniferous period derives its name from the fact that they were so common, they laid down the coal beds. So that's where the name Carboniferous comes from. They had this huge advantage that they had a vascular system, and the vascular system allowed them to distribute water and nutrients throughout the plant. Water and nutrients absorbed from whatever source, roots or wherever, could actually be distributed equally through the plant. Compounds made in the leaves during photosynthesis could also be distributed throughout the plant. A very, very efficient way of nutrition. But in addition, the vasculature provided them with structural support. Very often in the land plants, what we'll see is, first of all, the vasculature is full of water. So it's like tubes, and the water is incompressible. And so that the water inside the vasculature acts as a sort of skeleton. We can see this. If you allow a young plant to dry out, the plant will wilt. And that is because it's lost all the strength given to it by the water, the pressure inside the vasculature. That's the first way in which the vasculature helps. The second way it helps is as a plant matures, they tend to lay down very strong compounds in the tubes that make up the vasculature. And these are the compounds that actually create wood. That wood is laid down around in the walls of the vasculature of the plant. So that is the second way the vasculature allows the plant to grow and to stand upright against the force of gravity. These vascular plants were fabulously successful for millions, hundreds of millions of years, but they had one major disadvantage. And that disadvantage is that they still have an alternation of generations where the sperm have to swim to the Archegonium. This is a great limitation, because it means, first of all, the gametophytes have to be limited in size so they can easily be flooded. Second of all, it simply ties them to the margins of land, of the water bodies, etc. So they could not necessarily spread far out. Although you do find ferns in quite dry areas, if they are in dry areas, they require regular flooding in order to reproduce. So that's a big disadvantage. They're usually restricted to moist environments. The sperm, by the way, are flagellated sperm. And they bear strong resemblance throughout the plant kingdom. So the forerunners of the vascular plants, about 425 million years ago, but the forerunners of the vascular plants were actually quite small plants. They are distinguished, however, by the fact that there's a changeover now. And the gametophyte now, instead of being long-lived the way it is in the bryophytes, the gametophyte now is often short-lived. And it's often a relatively obscure little plant, as we'll see. But the sporophyte now becomes the dominant form, and the sporophyte becomes independent. The gametophyte dies, and the sporophyte is completely independent. In the bryophytes, it's parasitic on the gametophyte. In all of the other plants, all the other land plants, the sporophyte is the dominant form. Even if you look at flowering plants, the plants you see in front of you, those are actually sporophytes. We'll learn later where the gametophyte is. So the second thing about these land plants, obviously they had a vasculature, and the vasculature consists of two important tube forms. The one is called xylem, and xylem conducts fluids upwards from the roots up. So it's the major water conducting and mineral nutrient conducting system. Phloem is the other kind of vasculature, and it conducts products of photosynthesis and everything from leaves and branches and everything throughout the plant. It can actually distribute sideways and down. The third thing that characterizes the vascular plants is they have true roots. That is, the roots are an extension of the plant with their own vasculature, which can absorb water and nutrients and then literally pump it to the rest of the plant. The third thing is, the other thing is they have true leaves. In the gametophytes, although we call them leaves, the little flat things that come off the side, they're not actually true leaves. They're more like branches, flattened branches. A true leaf is an organ system in its own right. And we'll see a little bit more about structures later on. Okay, so here's a very primitive, this has actually been found in fossil records. This is a very primitive vascular plant, and this is a sporophyte, growing entirely independent. This was no more than inches tall, but it has a very distinctive vasculature. And you can see that it is already able to stand upright. This was probably several inches tall. And at the top, these are the sporangia here, where meiosis is taking place. And just as before, they produce spores, and the spores are liberated to form gametophytes. The gametophytes are not present in the fossil record. But gametophytes, if we can surmise anything from what we know about the vascular non-seed plants, the gametophytes were probably small and short-lived. So here we have the dominant sporophyte, very little small gametophytes. Here is a fern gametophyte, no more than probably than a centimeter or so across. You can definitely find these, especially this time of year when it's still damp undergrowth. If you look under a stand of ferns, you may well be able to find small gametophyte plants. They live a relatively short lifespan. Obviously, they're photosynthetic. You can see here that they are photosynthetic. In some ferns, the gametophytes are separate. You get male and female gametophytes separate from one another. But in many of the ferns, the plant has both Archegonia and Antheridia, although in that case, they often have mechanisms to stop self-fertilization. They have to be fertilized from another plant. Here's a gametophyte with a sporophyte attached. So this is grown from an Archegonium, which has been fertilized. The gametophyte has to be flooded with water so that sperm can swim to it, just as in the Bryophytes. And the sporophyte is initially parasitic on the gametophyte, but then the gametophyte dies and the sporophyte continues and may live for a very, very, very long time, decades, if not longer. So this is a sporophyte. This group also has another characteristic, and that is that the sporangia are usually organized on the underneath of the leaves. So you probably know this. You turn over a fern and you see those dark patches underneath the leaf here. Depends on the species of fern. They have different organizations. But these are sporangia. These are organizations here, and they're called the sori. And the little biological joke, which nobody ever laughs at, is the underneath of a fern is a site for sori. So that's the way to remember it. They usually, not always, have a cover over them, and they are a collection of sporangia. Here is a single sporangium here, there. It has a stalk attaching it there, and there's a whole cluster. Here's another one there, another one there. Inside, a whole parcel of spores. And under the correct conditions, this sporangium will open and will liberate the spores. The spores are very small and are very easily blown away by wind to settle somewhere else to form new gametophytes. So the life cycle, you can probably already guess. You can probably already work out more or less what the life cycle is. Here's a mature sporophyte. The mature sporophyte is diploid, but in its sporangia, it undergoes meiosis to produce spores. The spores disperse and they form gametophytes. The gametophytes have Archegonia, which is the female part, and the Archegonia hold an egg. They're still embryophytes. They hold the egg. The sperm have to swim to the egg, so they need to be flooded. That is one of the things that limits the size of the gametophyte. It's an advantage to be small and flat, because then you're easily flooded to have fertilization. After fertilization, the whole gametophyte is haploid. So it produces gametes by mitosis, because meiosis has already taken place. So the gametophyte is haploid. Fertilization, we get a diploid embryo. The diploid embryo develops parasitic on the gametophyte, and now the gametophyte dies. It is short-lived and dies. I've given you a sheet for you to fill in as an exercise, the various details. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the actual vasculature itself. We are not in this class. We're not going to. The vasculature is actually quite complex, but we are not going to discuss it in anything but a little survey detail. So we're going to consider these two kinds, the xylem and the phloem. Xylem is principally a water conducting system. And in fact, the xylem cells are very often no longer living. And the xylem cells get strengthened by putting down a very, very strong coating initially around the cell membrane as part of the cell wall. And once that coating is complete, then the cell may actually die, and leaving this tube behind. The substance of real importance in strengthening the xylem is lignin. And lignin not only maintains the integrity of the tube, but it provides a huge amount of strength to the plant. And lignin is what makes up wood. So wood is principally lignin. The phloem are actually living cells, and they are continually renewed, and they are, because they distribute products of photosynthesis, etc., throughout the plant. So there are two functions: distribution of water and nutrients, etc. Second function, provide structural strength to the plant. Now, in the discussing the structure of spores, there are two kinds of spore that we need to think about. Many of the seedless vascular plants, the ferns and everything, we say they are homosperous. They only have one size of spore, and that spore that produces a gametophyte with both male and female. But there is a group which are heterosperous. That is, they have one kind of spore which is very large, and one which is really small. And the large one is the female. The small one is the male. The large one is called a megaspore, and the megaspore gives rise to female gametophytes. The small one is a microspore, and it gives rise to male gametophytes. The reason we're so interested in this is because you can picture something, a system, whereby we take those megaspores and we actually dress them in a coat, and we get to something very close to a seed. So that's why we kind of cock our eyebrows when we hear about megaspores and microspores, because it begins to sound very like something like the kind of egg that we see in gametophytes, in the gymnosperms and in the flowering plants. And the microspore begins to sound very much like pollen. And that is the kind of idea we need to think about. Remember that most seedless vascular plants are homosperous, but there are some which are heterosperous. And there is one group that we've become particularly interested in, which is in the fossil record, which are called the seed ferns, where in fact that megaspore does get dressed with a seed coat, which really makes us look at it with great interest. So Let's have a look at some of the seedless vascular plants, just the different kinds. There are two big phyla in the seedless vascular plants. I've mentioned them already. The first are this phylum Lycophyte. These are called the club mosses. There are a couple of allied groups as well. This one, this is a Lycophyte here. I've showed you earlier in a picture. And this is a very common one called Sedanella, which you often see. And you often see it in greenhouses and places like that. It can be quite a nuisance. It can be a weed plant in actual fact. The other group are called the Pterophyte, and those are the true ferns, horsetails. And another group called the whisktails. So these are the ferns that you're familiar with. These you may also have seen. These are called the club moss. What am I talking about? The horsetails, rather. I'm sorry. These are called the horsetails, and these here are called whisk ferns. Whisk ferns are also a group that sometimes are weedy, but the horsetails are really of great interest to us because they're another group that once upon a time formed huge tree-like forms in the Carboniferous. These were major contributors to coal, for example. So these are true ferns, the horsetails, and then these are the whisk ferns. And I thought I had a picture. Yes, I do. So here's a kind of a Carboniferous period forest, and it's quite extraordinary because, especially because of the size of some of the plants. These are actually Lycophytes. So these are Lycophyte trees, probably 15 to 20 foot high trees, where now our Lycophytes look like this. Most of our Lycophytes are just small, obscure plants. Here in the Carboniferous, they could form huge trees, and they were actually one of the dominant members of these Carboniferous forests. These are giant horsetails. Again, they could be 10, 15 feet high with huge, thick trunks. And these are relatively simple ones. There are some which are even more elaborate. Along with that, the ferns, which just look very, very like our modern day ferns. And in fact, just 1 second, I have here, I don't know, can I do this? Here's one, which I collected myself in Pennsylvania. So that's from Carboniferous period. And that just looks very, very like any fern that you would get today. These are all the forms. They were very abundant and they grew incredibly quickly. They seem to have formed very, very dense forests, and the forest rapidly accumulated huge amounts of organic matter as these things fell over. And they formed such thick organic layers of plant material that it went completely anaerobic, and it very rapidly fossilized. And what it fossilized into was coal. This is the origin of all of our coal beds. This was hugely advantageous in ecological terms to the planet and to the further encroachment onto land, because they sucked out a huge amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they actually cooled the atmosphere. Large areas of the planet at that time were dry desert because and very hot. But the planet underwent a cooling which allowed the dispersion of land invading forms. I'll just point something out to you. Just think about this. At the time the Carboniferous around about then, all of these plants are busy sucking carbon dioxide out of the air. They suck so much out, they actually alter global climate. Well, what are we doing now? We are taking these same fossil fuels And we are liberating that carbon dioxide. We are liberating the carbon dioxide that was sucked up during the Carboniferous. We're liberating that all now, and we are pushing carbon dioxide levels back up to where they were before the Carboniferous started. Let me just check. Yes, all right. So it's an extraordinary thing to think about, but these are all sporophytes, and they all had to have arisen from small, obscure gametophytes. And that is one of the things which now has limits them to those marshy areas and to areas with very heavy rainfall where they can be assured of being flooded periodically to reproduce. So here is one of the groups that we are particularly interested in the pterophytes. This looks like an ordinary fern. It comes, they arise towards the end of the Carboniferous. And it's a particular group of these ferns that we no longer have any living representatives of them. We only see them in the fossil record. We can't say that these are ancestral to the seed plants. That is not possible. We can't even say that the ancestor lies somewhere in this group, but it's just very interesting for us to see how this group of plants, this group of ferns, develops a true seed. This is a megaspore there, and it has become invested with a heavy coat with sporopollen in it probably, which is resistant to desiccation. Now, remember something, that these are still growing on the sides of water bodies and everything. So if this thing falls into the water body, it can be washed away. It can be pushed up onto land. Maybe it gets dried out there, but it's resistant. Eventually, conditions will be suitable for this spore to germinate. And it's very difficult for us to look at this where we have a megaspore like this, which has been fertilized, which is going to be fertilized rather, going to germinate rather, dressed in a hard coating, which is a resistant form, and not say that that is a seed. And it is, it's a seed. There has to be, it's not a seed in the way that we think of in the flowering plants, for example. In the flowering plants, that seed, that megaspore, would actually have to be fertilized somehow. In this case, this megaspore is going to drift off and it's going to germinate, and it's going to form a new gametophyte of some sort. So there are a couple of steps that need to be undertaken before we form a seed the way that we have it in the flowering plants and the gymnosperms. But it's just very interesting that this group of ferns, the seed ferns, actually ended up producing a true seed. And it is not long, in evolutionary terms, it is not very much longer before we see the first of the true seed plants. And there in the seed plants, the life cycle becomes a little bit different, but we can still see the roots of the life cycle, the alternation of generations, as we have in the primitive groups that we've talked about here. Okay, so I'll leave it there for today. And on Monday, we'll carry on. And on Monday, I'll try and have everything set up perfectly so that we have a live class in case you have any questions to ask.